Welcome back to the Latin MedTech Leaders Podcast, a conversation with leaders who have succeeded or plan to succeed in Latin America. Please subscribe on your favorite podcasting platform, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, etc. Today, our guest is Ruben Gaitan Ortiz, CEO at Alandra Medical. Ruben is developing novel monitoring technologies to save the most vulnerable patients from dire complications in cardiac surgery and critical care. So, Ruben, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Awesome, Ruben. So, let's talk about your journey to Latin America, Ruben. How is it that you got involved with the region?
Absolutely. So, well, first of all, I was born in Mexico, so I'm naturally engaged with the region. And well, I have a background in biomedical engineering. So, right after I finalized my studies at university, I joined and started a company, developing medical devices and trying to bring innovations from the university into the market. This was a small company which was launched by a professor at the university. And essentially, my role was like only in engineering aspects, developing electric circuits and some software, kind of in a very, very geeky way of the innovation, if you will. And after some years, the company was acquired by another entrepreneurial effort, and it received some VC funding. And in that moment, it was kind of an inflection point because the company ceased to be, like an only academic endeavor, and then it started to be like a more professional company. So in that period, we developed our processes with certifications, and we actually started to offer, developing services for other customers, also in Mexico and also in the USA. And at the same time, the company was incubating its own technology, most of which came from the previous company that I mentioned before. And after some time, we understood that even if we were having some good traction in terms of getting customers for developing very specific portion of the devices in Mexico, this was not really creating value for our investors. And that's when we decided kind of only to focus into the technologies that came from the portfolio, from the original portfolio of the company. And for that reason, it's been like around maybe 4 or 5 years in which we have been laser focusing on developing our own IP portfolio. As you mentioned during the intro, kind of our start product or our main efforts are, being targeted to critical care and to cardiac surgery. Essentially, the problem that we are trying to solve right now is helping doctors, particularly in these settings, having objective information for delivering better treatment for the patients. So, for instance, when a patient enters cardiac surgery or when a patient is admitted into the ICU, doctors need to have a fair assessment of how likely it is for the patient to develop complications. And in that regard, there are a number of technologies and a number of biomarkers that offer some information, but none of them are truly objective. And there are some biases in the methodologies. So our device is essentially a gastric feeding tube. It's a tube that goes all the way down to the stomach from the nostril, from the mouth, and the catheter measures certain electrical properties that correlate with the development of complications. So we have recently completed a clinical trial here in Mexico in a very specific patient population, patients receiving elective cardiac surgery, and the results indicate that our technology is capable, of differentiating between the patients that undergo without complications and the patients that develop, complications and eventually die. So the results are pretty encouraging. And well, now we are using this data for, getting regulatory approval for the technology in Western market, let's say the US, the UK, and of course Mexico, and we are also putting our eyes in Australia. So that's kind of the natural relationship that I have with Latin America, and yeah, I mean, I feel absolutely privileged to have this opportunity of developing this kind of technology here, and also kind of serving perhaps as inspiration, hopefully for other entrepreneurs willing to start this journey.
Yes, yes. Well, congratulations, Ruben. Seeing a startup medical device company from Latin America is a surprise, and I'm proud of it as Latin American because it's not common. I've been in this industry for about 13 years now, and I've seen less than three companies. I will say less than. I mean, it's just a handful of companies coming out of Latin America with and fewer of them with great products like yours and that are going in the right path. So I'm very pleased to see your success, and to see something good coming out of your efforts in the region. So let's talk about trends, Ruben. What trends do you see happening in Latin America that are relevant to our discussion about clinical research or commercialization or development of medical technologies?
Well, from the way I see it is that Latin America has usually been a place where companies come to sell their devices or manufacture the devices, not necessarily a continent which creates a new technology or that launches innovations. I think that there are good reasons for being optimistic in this regard because from let's say from the last I don't know maybe 7 to 10 years there have been some very timid efforts, for starting developing technology. One example, of course, is Alandra Medical. But I have seen that lately, first of all, these kind of endeavors were mostly funded by the government in terms of grants. And usually the companies kind of were living for maybe about 6 or 7 years before finding financial collapse. What I have been seeing lately is that VC capital and private money is, pouring into these kind of endeavors. And I think that, success will naturally attract more and more investment into these kind of projects. I am very happy to see that, let's say, funds like SoftBank or Kasek are starting, to bet and to put money into medical technology. Not necessarily, let's say, sophisticated medical technology in terms of, a monitoring device with I don't know, an implantable component or something like that, but more into, let's say, digital technologies, particularly those which are, that you can install in a cell phone or whatever, and then you have like an app measuring biomarkers or like an app measuring fitness and things like that. And I think that success will eventually create more appetite within the investment community to fund even riskier projects. In the case of Alandra, well, this is certainly kind of a riskier project, if you will, because we are an invasive device. We are in contact with the patient, and the kind of information that our device is producing can have an impact, in on the outcome of critically ill patients. So from that perspective, investment is really not flowing, as much as I would like to. But I think that, and this is something that actually motivates my team and I, that in the measure that we get success with this technology, other investors will be willing to put the money in there. But regardless of that, I really think that we have seen more and more startups, operating in the, let's say, wellness or healthcare environment. And yeah, I think that that is something very nice. On the other hand, I think that a major advantage that we have, at least in Mexico, is that we are networked with the US. And that is also creating a very, very interesting trend, which is medical tourism. I mean, this is completely, different from innovation part. But I think that it is also kind of a massive business opportunities for healthcare companies here in Mexico, because if you go to the border, you will see flocks of American tourists, getting to the country for receiving, let's say, dental care, or even what is called the pharmaceutical tourism. American citizens crossing the border for getting the same medication, but I don't know, maybe 10 times cheaper. So this trend is increasingly being capitalized by entrepreneurs and by the companies in here. And actually, if you go to, let's say, private hospitals in Mexico City, you will see Americans looking for, cardiac surgery or kind of, very procedures to be performing here. Of course, there is, some skepticism about whether or not healthcare here, is reliable. But the truth is that, increasingly more and more people are coming to Mexico to, get affordable healthcare. And, really, our physicians, most of them have received training in the US or in Israel or in Europe. So quality of healthcare, I believe that can be very similar to what you can get in the US, at least in private hospitals, but at a fraction of the cost. So I believe that, I'm not sure what will be the result of these different parameters, but it's certainly exciting. I mean, if you have, like, on one hand, private money pouring into entrepreneurial efforts for medical technology, and on the other hand, you have like Americans coming into the country for getting treatment. So I think it's kind of an interesting, a fertile soil for for the market. And yeah, I would say that those are perhaps the two trends that I see most exciting, for Latin America. And of course, in terms of clinical trials, we have kind of, our population is suffering mostly the same non-communicable diseases than Western markets, if you will. So we have diabetes, and we have kind of the same grievances that you will find in the States or Western Europe. We have them in here, and of course, needless to say, the cost effectiveness of running a trial here in Mexico, is very, very attractive. So that'll be kind of the traditional trend, if you will. But I think that the two most exciting trends are medical tourism and private money pouring into local,
Yeah.
entrepreneurs.
Mhm. Yes, yes, that's very interesting, especially about the private money pouring into local companies from VC funds. Are you seeing other companies like yours in Mexico with innovative products receiving funds? I mean, have you been a witness to success cases?
Certainly, yes. I mean, there's a company, I do not remember the name in this moment, shame on me, but they are, screening breast cancer. So essentially, what they are using is thermal imaging technology, and they're able, to detect cancer, or at least, tissue anomalies, without necessarily needing the traditional mastography. So that, of course, having an infrared camera is very cheaper than having, like extra equipment. And as far as I know, this company has already received funding for developing the technology. And if my memory serves me well, they are already applying for a 510K in the US
Wow,
for the technology.
nice.
And yeah, and in and there are some other efforts. I mean, not necessarily in the diagnostic space, but mostly in the wellness space. So you have like companies developing wearables for measuring a certain signals from the body in a way that you can maybe correlate with them with other data, and to deliver wellness advice to the patients. So yeah, I mean, I really must mention that I have not seen another company developing like biomarkers as we are, but I think there's a very interesting case in Chile, and in this case, I do remember the name. I think is Levita Magnetics. I mean, as far as I understand, they're like Chilean entrepreneurs, and they have received funding from the USA. And what they're developing is, I understand, is a robot assisted surgery, and in some measure they're using magnetic fields for control the robot. I'm not really sure, but I think it's kind of a remarkable example of people from Chile developing this kind of technology. Another company that I have very good in mind is Miraculous. I think they also come from Chile, and they are currently based in San Francisco, and they are developing this fantastic platform for developing laboratory analysis over blood samples, and they offer this platform for customizing different uh, laboratory experiments, in a miniaturist platform. And I think that they have also received, funding not only from Latin America but also from American investors. So I think those two are very, very inspirational examples for us, for Alandra, in a way that it is possible to develop this kind of innovations and getting funding not only from friends and family and from the government, but also, from real VC capital.
Excellent. Yeah, I just text you here another company that I learned about, Actipulse from Mexico. They opened an office in Silicon Valley and they got funding from the United States. So I'm very happy to see all those examples of companies succeeding in Latin America with their innovations, because as you correctly said, the region is not famous for that, but
Yes.
slowly we're gonna get there. So,
Exactly.
all right, Ruben. Yeah, go ahead.
So sorry, I was just saying. I mean, and I think that all of the companies that to some extent we have evolved to a, let's say, a VC ready stage. I think that besides the motivation of of course having a successful business, also creating success stories in Latin America. I think that should also be an inspiration for us all. Because that will certainly bring more interest in the region, not only for manufacturing for clinical trials, but also kind of for an innovation laboratory, so to speak.
Yes, yes, exactly. That's a great point because um, the talent available in the United States, in Silicon Valley, in Minnesota, in Massachusetts, is world class talent that but at the same time, it's very expensive, right? So if you want to develop something using those engineers, biomed engineers or software engineers, I mean, you have to pay a hefty price. And I think there's comparable or close to comparable talent in Latin American countries like Mexico, Colombia, Chile, Argentina, Brazil, that companies can tap into to develop technologies at a lower price and combine that with the other talent in the United States so that they can save money, right? And that's a
Of
big
course.
issue for startups.
And most interestingly, I mean, at least in my experience, when I've been to Minnesota or to these other major innovation centers, typically the engineering teams, combine. I mean, like scientists and engineers from all over the world, right? So I was in Minnesota just having, okay, so you're from Mexico as well, but you're here in Minnesota working medical innovation. So yeah, it's kind of, I think that part of the glory, of the US in terms of innovation is that capability of attracting talent from all over the world. And so, yeah, hopefully we can replicate that in our countries as well.
Exactly. Exactly. Well, and people like you are making our region famous for medical innovation. Congratulations again. All right, Ruben. So let's talk about what you're doing in Latin America. What is it that you are involved in right now? Clinical research, commercialization, development. How is Latin America fitting into your plans to develop your technology?
Absolutely. So let's say from the Alandra perspective, I mean, as I mentioned before, we are like 100% focused on, getting this technology to the market. We have already concluded, of course, the research and development phase, and recently the clinical validation. And right now we are, putting all of our efforts in getting, the regulatory process for, start selling this technology. First, let's say in Western markets, or Mexico, of course, included, but also the USA and in Europe. We are facing some challenges, for the European market because, as you know, recently they have the medical device regulation, and it is not a matter that our technical information is not, up to the level required by the MDR, but it's more, a saturation problem. Notified bodies in Europe completely, incapable of coping with the demand. So that's kind of the challenge that we have right now. But at the same time, we are pursuing the approval for COFEPRIS and also for the FDA. And the good news, for getting approval in the USA is that our technology, can fit into a 510K process. So we're optimistic about that. And we are also putting our eyes in Australia because Australia right now has very interesting, incentives for creating medical innovation there. And so that's where we are right now. I mean, we are, we have 90% ready our technical dossier. Together with that, we are creating the scientific publications of the results from our experiments because we need to cover all of the aspects of the innovation, not only the regulation, but also we need to pay attention to the clinical papers and also to the IP and all of that. So we are also making those aspects stronger in the business. And yeah, and let's say on a more personal note, I have some side projects with the family which are also trying to capitalize in this trend that I mentioned before. So we are also working with dermatology, and it's very curious that everything that is related to beauty and to personal care in Mexico is kind of on fire right now. So let's say whatever from laser hair removal or to cosmeceuticals, which are these high-end dermatological products that can, improve the health of the skin and that kind of thing. Is also a very interesting trend. Kind of the middle class is increasingly having, an this kind of products. So that's also a very interesting trend that we are, focusing right now, at least in the closest sphere, which is the family. But yeah, I mean, again, in terms of Alandra, we hope to get these approvals within the next year. Of course, we have already had in terms of Euro Brexit, and then we have the pandemic. Certain unexpected things have came across, but we are kind of 100% convinced that we can make it and that we can get these approvals. And of course, once that you get an FDA approval, capital, is far, complicated to attract, right? So that's part of the strategic reason that we are pursuing also this kind of approvals in Western markets.
Very good. So, Ruben, let's focus for a minute on your experience with your clinical trial, with your early feasibility, first in human clinical trial in Mexico, and your experience with corporate priest, because I'm sure that's where our audience uh, wants to focus the conversation, because that's one of the reasons companies, medical device companies from the U.S. go to Latin America to test or to validate the safety and efficacy of their innovations. So, what's the framework for doing a clinical trial in Mexico? What was your experience finding investigators, finding sites? What was your experience with corporate priests, etc.? Could you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So let's say I'll start, with the research component of this. So in our experience, doctors, particularly young doctors, are very keen on trying, new technologies and trying new pharmaceuticals. And there are kind of many drivers for that. One of them is that they want to create a reputation for their own. So that's kind of a big driver for them to get involved with these kind of projects. And on the other hand, kind of the incentives that most of the doctors that work, let's say in public centers, is that the more publications that they have, the more likely is that they can, grow within the hospital. And well, that makes it, I wouldn't say easier, but I would say it really helps, to attract this kind of talent into projects like this. Something that I must mention though is that well, Alandra has only kind of operated with public hospitals, particularly, the hospital for cardiology and for respiratory diseases and also for nutrition. Is that these hospitals are subjected to state bureaucracy, and there are also some unions which are operating in there. So that can bring some frustrations, when you are kind of planning and developing a trial. And that is something that I would really advise other companies to keep in mind, that, state bureaucracy is something that exists in the public centers. And well, that may influence their decision for getting perhaps into a private hospital. But in terms, of the, I would say intellectual capital within the hospitals, this is absolutely fantastic. And yeah, I mean, in our experience, the patient population is available, at least for our kind of device. I'm pretty sure that any company working with grievances from the Western world will be able to find a patient population for the study here in Mexico. And also, regardless of focusing into private or public healthcare, they will certainly find a hospital for that. And yes, so in terms of coffee priest, I think that if you have a very good understanding and also very good counseling, you can really get a grasp on the processes and really get a grasp, on what it is required for, having a decent human study in here. And yeah, my advice would be just like, get a reliable consultant from Mexico, and, be really diligent in terms of understanding the local relation. I mean, and if you tick all of the boxes, you will really not find any kind of problem. Uh, as a side note, some people, is tempted to recommend that they need to create, certain personal relationship with the officials at Coffee Priest. I will really discourage that kind of approach, because I mean, you can do it, by the book, and you can tick all of the boxes, and you will really, you will not be in need of any kind of friendship, with the people. So I'm mentioning this because in many instances have heard that kind of advice. That's advice you see, and that's advice that I have heard, in other instances. So I will really discourage that. And I would say that as long as you are really diligent in understanding the regulation, all you need is kind of intellectual capital, and that's it, that you will be on the other side.
Okay, so in terms of timeline, how long will it take to get a trial approval in general? I mean, based on your experience and based on what you've heard about other companies doing similar studies in Mexico, what will be the ethics committee approval timeline? What will be the corporate priest approval timeline? And in general, how long will it take for a company to from the day they submit to the ethics committee and the day they get the patient on the table?
Okay, let me put it this way. For this last trial that we executed, let's say from day one in which we say, okay, hello guys, we want to run a clinical trial in the hospital, to day one with patient, it was 15 months, from the very first day in which we, were engaging with the physicians and we were developing the
Yes.
protocol.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
the day in which we have the very first patient, it was around 15 months, give or take. And in
Yeah.
terms of coffee breeze, something that I would really recommend them is to go to what is called goodness in English. Is the I can get the name for you, but it's kind of a preliminary application that you have for your protocol before you file the actual thing. So that is very useful because Coffee Priest can came back to you, with some recommendations or with some gaps in your paperwork. And again, I mean, as long as you understand what the law says about clinical trials here, I mean, you can be, I would say, pretty confident that you can get your paperwork, approved within the time frames that are advertised on Coffee Priest website. So yeah, I mean that's kind of our experience. I cannot mention kind of clear dates. I mean to say like it was 3 months and there 4 months.
Yeah. Hmm.
But again, from day one to our first patient, it was around 15 months. And again, just for having some parameters, this was a trial on elective cardiac surgeries. Very very ill patients, and uh, the check marks that we had to pay attention to in terms of the safety of the trial were kind of noticeable. And my assumption would be that trials with less risky patient populations most likely will require a shorter period of time for getting the trial approved and for getting the first patient. And
Okay.
after that, during the trial,
Mhm.
we had zero adverse events related to our technology. However, if a patient dies during your study, whether it is related to your technology or not, you still need to report it to the coffee priest. And I can tell you that the reporting process was absolutely flawless. I mean, we
Okay.
just sent the paperwork, and we had absolutely zero inconvenience in that regard. And also, when we notified coffee priest that our study was completed, I mean, it was just kind of a matter of creating the paper once and sending it over, and it was absolutely fine. So yeah, I mean, again, I cannot recommend it enough to have a good understanding and to have a good counseling, and you should be able to run a smooth trial here.
Very good. But you mentioned something that is very intriguing. You mentioned something like a pre-submission to cover priest. Are you talking about un predictamen?
Exactly. Yes, that was the thing that I was trying
Okay,
to answer. Yes.
predictamine. All right.
Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? Is that something that is because I heard that before the pandemic it was a real thing. Was the unidades de predictamen were everywhere in Mexico, but after the pandemic that went away and they are no longer active. Could you clarify on that? I mean, how does it work?
You know what? I don't know. That's a very good point. I mean, in our yeah, because I mean, yeah, we submitted that predictamen before the pandemic, and yeah,
Okay. All right. All
so
right.
shame on me. I'm not really sure about how it's working then right now, because yes, I mean, in our case, it was very smooth, but after the pandemic, yeah, most likely it has suffered some sort of disruption.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And for the audience here, predictaming is something in the Mexican system to approve uh, new medical device, well, new clinical research studies, pharma or devices that allows third-party private entities to review the dossier before the dossier is sent to cover priest. So this private entity is, of course, certified by cover priest to review these dossiers, and cover priest trust the opinion of these third party entities. And after you get the review and the opinion of the third party entity that they'll call unidades de predictamen, then you can just attach that letter to your dossier to cover priest, and you should get a very, very fast approval at cover priest because you already have a pre-approval at the predictamen unit.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, but yeah,
So
as you're pointing out, yeah, most likely there's some disruption in there after the pandemic, and also after maybe some restructuring inside Coffee Priest. But yeah, I mean, I really need. I'm taking that away, as homework after this call.
yes, yes, I think that's a great thing that Mexico has also for the registration of commercial devices. They have these terceros autorizados, right? Authorized third parties, which is fantastic. It's a great system, but the new government, Lopez Obrador, I understand, took that away or restructured that because there was some corruption involved in that uh, model. So probably
Well, yeah,
similar thing
of
happened
course,
with
we can go
Gaitan.
down the rabbit hole, but yeah, I mean, that will take us to very dark places. So,
Yes, I know. Well, let's avoid that. But my opinion of Coffee Priest now, and from what I hear from people, I just came back from Mexico last week, is that Coffee Priest is really making an effort to fix the reputation of inefficiencies that he had. Is making their timelines way better and making their processes more predictable. And by the way, I also heard that Coffer Priest just joined ICH, the International Council of Harmonization, which is a big deal. I understand he's the only agency in Latin America that is part of ICH for clinical research. So that sends the signal that Coffer Priest really wants to be competitive in Latin America for the approval of clinical trials. So I'm very happy to hear that.
absolutely, absolutely. And I must also mention, I mean, I think that within the very few positive things, if you will, after the pandemic, is that I think it was a serious attention call for all of Latin America in terms that we tried, at least in Mexico, there were various incentives to develop, respiratory machines and stuff like that. And I think that we were just hit like a brick wall in terms that, I mean, you can't build respiratory machines out of the blue. And I mean, of course, there were successful efforts to some measure, but in general, kind of the scientific community, the engineering community, and the kind of all of the ecosystem, we just the truth hit hard in a way that we do not have a robust ecosystem for this kind of emergencies. And I think that will down the road, influence politics and influence, how coffee priests and other stakeholders, operate in a way that we really need to have, a robust ecosystem in place for these kind of emergencies. So again, I mean, I really admire the people that went through the process of building these kind of machines. But I think that one of the results is that we are shocked by the fact that, I mean, our capabilities for responding to these things is not what was necessarily 2 or 3 years ago. So I think that one of the positive things that we can say after all of this pain is that this will shake the policy around technology development here.
Yes, you are correct on that. I was stuck in Colombia during the pandemic, and I witnessed the development of about at least 10 different efforts to uh, create ventilators by local universities and innovation groups, but nothing really materialized. And the regulatory agency had a hard time coping with the demand for uh, reviews and applications for approvals. And you could see, because those are public documents, I was reading all of them, you could see that the innovators didn't really know what to do, and the regulatory agency didn't even know what to do either. So
That's right.
it was a lot of confusion. Yeah,
And again, I mean, this is not a matter of blaming people or kind of. I mean, it is a matter that as a society we have
yeah,
not created the conditions for being able to respond to this kind of emergency. So I really want to be optimistic in the way that this should shape policy, down
yeah.
the road for the next
Agree.
pandemic. It's just a matter of
Exactly.
time. So sadly.
Yeah. Yeah. Now Colombia's regulatory agency, VIMA, is a better agency because of the pandemic. I think the digitalization of the agency was fantastic. The new people that they had to put in the committees to evaluate these technologies, it was fantastic because they had to up their game for these new influx of innovation that came during the pandemic. So it's a win-win for everybody at the end, I think. Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right, Ruben, I think we're close to the end of the show. And do you have any final words of wisdom, any final thoughts that you want to share with the audience before we close?
Well, I mean, I just want to stress that I mean we can do very nice things in here, and as I mentioned before, the latest experience with the pandemic, and together with with these trends of busy money pouring into Latin America, and the size of the market in Latin America, I think is those are conditions promissory of having an innovation cluster in here. And again, I mean, we should not try to copy models from Silicon Valley, which is, kind of this weird thing that everybody talks about. I mean, of course, Silicon Valley works because it developed under very specific conditions. We have different conditions, different, society and whatever. So instead of trying to emulate what is being done in there, I think we should really just study those success stories and create our own ecosystem for innovation. Because I mean, we have fantastic universities, we have fantastic intellectual capital. We all speak Spanish, and we are a gigantic continent. So I think that there are conditions, and I think that I mean there are very good reasons for being optimistic and to attract prosperity for our societies.
Well said. Thank you, Ruben. All right. So it was great having you here, Ruben. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge. And I look forward to being in touch with you.
Thank you very much, Julio. Thank you very much for having me. And well, thank you.
Bye.
Bye bye.